Hey guys, we're unboxing and doing our first prints on the Creality Halot Mage Pro 8K. So at this point, I've just taken the box off the top and some of the cellophane plastic wrap came off with it. It was kind of attached to some of this tape here. As we saw on the Mage, so this is the Mage Pro, as we saw on the Mage, we have this nice flip-top lid, which I remember saying I was a fan of because it's inconvenient to kind of carefully lift off a lid and then have to put it down somewhere, especially if your hands aren't the cleanest at the time. This is a nice solution. And it needs just a little bit of clearance above the resting height of the printer in order to do so, and maybe about 3 inches off the back. We'll pull out this foam carefully, because in the top here, there's a bunch of goodies. We've got a bag containing the sharpened scraper here, the plastic scraper, and then our paint strainers. So this is for filtering the resin out of the vat and back into the bottle. Make sure there's no little cured pieces of resin going back in that bottle. We have what looks like a serial number card for Creality Chit Box Pro and a USB stick. Got a couple Allen keys here. This will be for tightening the build plate and for the bed leveling process or build plate leveling process. The quick installation guide and after sales warranty card. Probably a small container of lubricant or grease. Yep, so this would be for your screw at the back there. In addition, we have this kind of corduroy vent tube that extends and holds an angle. So this goes in the back of the machine where there's a filtration system and an exhaust fan, and you can actually duct that exhaust fan out a window, let's say. Power cord, and that's it now. If we lift this one, looks like just off the top there. There, we expose the build plate, and there is a piece of foam sandwiched between the build plate here and the vat or the screen at the bottom. So we'll want to raise the Z up in order to kind of release that tension there. And we can already see some of the controls for the pump system. So one of the things that the Pro gets you, in addition to the original Halot Mage, is this kind of siphon pump system. So the idea is that you can have your vat of resin and siphon up the amount of resin that you need for the print. And if you think, maybe you didn't have as much resin as you thought you needed, it would be nice to just be able to add that in. So we're gonna take a look at how that works in practice. In theory, it's neat, especially as you get into larger printers where you can really use up a lot of resin quickly. The vat might not be as deep as it needs to be to hold all the resin you need for your particular print. So with all that said, we also have the replacement film for the bottom of the vat here, and it's probably FEP, as is usual, or MFEP, but it's essentially a non-stick, plastic sheet that we're used to being tensioned on the bottom of the vat. And there's the installation instructions on the card there. So just like the regular Mage, the Mage Pro is 10.3 inch screen, so that's diagonal, and it's an 8K screen, as it says right here on the front. But some differences between it and the Mage is that it has Wi-Fi and Ethernet, it has 2 USBs at the front, it has that integrated pump that we talked about, and it has a new light source. So the light source is 62% stronger or more intense than the previous light source was. So that will allow you to print even faster. Creality's published speed is 170 millimeters per hour. So that means that regardless of how much X and Y content you're putting on there, you can print 17 centimeters or 170 millimeters of vertical travel in a 60-minute time frame. I had mentioned the 8K display, and that 8K display in the X and Y direction gets you about 30 microns of detail, I think 29.7 microns of detail. So in that direction, that's the finest kind of detail you'll be able to capture. And then in the Z direction, you can go down to 10 microns if you really wanted to, but 30 or 50 is really more commonplace. So now I've talked a little bit about the features and specs and whatnot. We need to get this foam out of here and make sure that our build plate's level. To do that, I've plugged in the machine, and now we're going to take a look at the screen. Okay, so we're greeted with this screen. We choose our language as English, and I'll hit next. And so now we're going to connect to our Wi-Fi. And then after we've saved our password, we are back at the screen and we can see the check mark, so we should be good there. Okay, so if we go to settings, I can go to Wi-Fi, and I could change my Wi-Fi if I needed to. I can see my Wi-Fi symbol up here, so I've got good signal strength. We can see the details of the machine, our IP address, the current version that we're on. We can of course go back here and check for an update. Let's check on the network. Hey, new version. Let's install that new version before we go any further. And we'll just wait a couple minutes and it will likely restart, and then we'll just confirm that we got the update. All right, so the update downloaded, the machine restarted itself, and we're back here. Maybe about 5 or 6 minutes or so. If I go back into the settings and I check for update, there should be no updates anymore. We're good. You can also, if you choose not to connect your printer to the Wi-Fi, it is nice to know that you can do a local upgrade by downloading the firmware, using your computer, put it on the USB stick and plug it into here. Let's poke around some of the other settings. So we have maintenance settings. Under maintenance, we have the FEP film. So it's we can have an alert to remind us to replace the FEP film after a certain number of hours. This says 200 hours. Air filter is set to 300, as you see. And the feeding system. I don't know what maintenance offhand is required for the feeding system, so we'll have to take a look in the manual for that. So there are some time-lapse settings. Now it's interesting, this didn't come with a camera of sorts, but there are settings in the firmware to capture a picture on every X layers. So if I was to assume that there would be a USB camera that you would mount in here in some fashion, this would control that camera. We can reset our settings. We can change kind of the theme of the UI here. Language we already set when we set up the machine. And then back onto the main settings, we've got our details, which we looked at. It had all of our firmware versions and stuff here. We can connect it to the Creality cloud, which I'm not going to do. We have print settings. So under print settings, you have printing parameters. So usually when you're starting a print, you can actually modify some of these layer times and adjust them on the fly. But normally you'd be adjusting them in the slicer itself. And movement. So we'll get there in a sec. Halot box. So this is, there we go. Halot box is the software on your desktop that you can slice and send those prints directly to your machine over your Wi-Fi or your Ethernet. And in this case, you could allow the camera to be monitored through that slicing software, and you set a password to kind of secure the connection between the slicing software and your machine. The AP system. So this is the air purification system. So purification mode is set to manual. If we set this to automatic, then it will continue exhausting for X minutes after the print job is done, or you can manually control it. We'll just set it to automatic as one less thing I have to worry about. And I think 20 minutes is a bit excessive, maybe 10 minutes is probably fine. And then feeding system. So this is the new resin feeding system that we talked about. And so we could have auto. Please check whether the resin bottle and tank balance is normal. Feed delay 1 minute, return on delay. You know what? We're gonna have to play with this and read through the rest of the manual before we know what this does. Let me actually turn that back off of auto. I'll come back to that. For now, looping all the way back around, we need to raise the build platform to get that foam out between the FEP film and the build platform. So let's go, we want to just manually move it up. See, I don't like these. Okay, we'll go leveling here. So it very rapidly moved to the top. I'm going to quickly get this out of here. And just in the interest of time, because I didn't realize it was going to be so fast, I'm going to pull the build plate completely off here. And I'm doing this because I didn't have time to loosen these bolts. Normally you would loosen these bolts so that the build plate's just flopping around so that it can go down and properly level the build plate. So I've taken it off just so we don't accidentally potentially smash into the screen, and I'm going to loosen these bolts off the printer. So I've just rested this on that foam just for fun. And as I said, you would normally loosen these when you go to do your leveling process, but there was no manual Z up or down. I just wanted to move it enough to get this vat out of there and the foam out of there. But anyway, we're going to loosen these bolts entirely so that I can demonstrate the build plate flopping around there. So there you go. You can see how the build plate is just kind of loose. This back one here is gripping a little bit still. So what I'll do is I'll actually hit leveling again, just to bring it back up to the top. To give me some space here. Okay. And we want to put a piece of paper down in here. Thanks to some of you in the comments on the original Halot Mage, you mentioned that the calibration card for leveling is actually inside this envelope, which I agree with the commenter there. It's kind of silly to have that in here because this envelope is meant for if you need to replace the FEP film, and we're not replacing it. We just need to level our existing build plate. So we have this kind of plasticky paper sheet, and I can very well just lift this up to make enough space. There we go. Perfect, like that. And so with that sheet under there, we want to apply even pressure, front to back and side to side, really. So ideally like that, but we can also just do kind of one side at a time. And as we're applying that pressure, we're going to tighten these screws. And with that, there should be equal tension on the paper. And you can even kind of check as you slide it out. There's constant pressure. A little bit light here, perhaps. Right? There's more pressure on this side. So I could end up doing this again. Because if there's more of a gap on this side than there is on this side, prints over here are not going to stick to the build plate as well as the ones over here are. So the goal is to have it uniform. You can even kind of check like one half and then check the other half independently. But I know that this side was fine. It's just over here that needs to be a little bit tighter. Okay, so I'll hit leveling one last time to bring it back up. And we're going to put the vat in, but you see at the bottom, please remove before printing. There is a little sticker and probably a protective, just a sticker, not even a protective sheet. There you go. So just this little sticker, we'll remove that. Put this all the way to the back. You'll notice at that back corner there, the nozzle for the little resin pump gets tipped down by a little lever. So just make sure you've got, that all the way to the back. There we go. So apparently reset position brings the build plate all the way to the top. So it essentially homes the build plate at the top of the machine instead of zeroing it out at the bottom. Be nice if that verbiage was a little more clear. When I was removing the packaging, that's what I wanted to do, is move it to the top. I really didn't want to do the leveling process. But anyway, reset position, build plate at the top. Good to know. If we look at a couple more things, I'll pull this vat back out real quick. And we go back out to this menu here. If we go to if we go to cleaning, under cleaning, it says confirm whether you need to clean the trough, and we can say settings. I want to do it for 8 seconds. So I'll cleaning and I'll hit OK. We'll actually see the entire surface light up, right? And so what that would do, if we had a dirty vat, if we had vat with pieces of hardened material in it, we could actually cure the entire bottom layer of the vat and then use our plastic scraper to scrape off an entire sheet of that, removing all those particles from the bottom of the vat. So that's what cleaning is for. And then under that settings, that's where you would change the number of seconds that you need to expose to harden that bottom layer. Now it does use a lot of resin, but sometimes it's a necessary evil to get all the bits out of your vat. While we're here, let's take a look at what's on this USB stick. Plug it in, we'll hit print, and we can see there's 3 files here. This one says normal Nurksen group file spec. This one says Dynax Cardioff and Titanic. So if I click on this, we should be able to see what the model is here. So it's imported it from the USB into the printer's memory. And then if I select it here, like I said, we could change the print parameters, or you can use the parameters that the file was sliced with in the slicer. So we'll just take a look. We'll take a look. There we go. That's what the model looks like. It might be a ship. It might actually be a Titanic. It's going to take about 12 hours and 72 milliliters of resin or so. And it's 50 micron layer height, which is pretty typical. If I go back and choose it again and just say file parameters, we can actually see the settings here that were imported from the file. So it was sliced with 1.2 second exposure, 10 milliseconds motor speed, that's the Z motor here. An initial exposure of 30 seconds, so for those first layers, we want them to really bind to the build plate. It's going to rise 8 millimeters between layer, and it's going to do 4 of those bottom exposure layers at 30 seconds. And you can see, oops, I think there was actually an option here. Air purification system is going to be on in this case. You could turn that on or off. And if you actually chose that file and said, use the printer's parameters, these are the parameters that were saved on the printer as a whole. So those were the settings that we saw when we were poking around early here under print settings, printing parameters. These are the machine level parameters rather than the file level parameters. So you can kind of have a preset, if you will, for your machine. Especially if something is sliced for a particular resin and you're now running a different resin, it's nice to be able to override those as well, rather than having to reslice the whole thing. So we have 3 test prints that we're going to print. But before we do that, I actually want to hook up that air purification hose. So just before we get printing, there's 2 things I want to address. So we've got the hose to duct the air purification. So this kind of just twist locks like that. And then you can extend this probably about 6 feet or so out a window or what have you. And here is the hose for the pump system. You would put this into your bottle or your bag of resin, and then you can use those buttons on the pump to prime it. But at this point, you could load the resin manually and print as normal, or we can then use this to do those prints. So after you've run the installer and next, you get to the end and install, and we're gonna run Halot box. So we're initially presented with the Halot 1 in this case. So we need to make sure that we change our printer. We can hit add, and we're going to look for the Mage Pro. Hit add, and now we can see the build plate is much larger here. Now you'll see under parameter config there are 2 different configs. So the default is kind of your default speeds, your normal kind of speeds. And then on the printer itself, there's an option in the menu to turn on Dynax. So this is their extremely fast printing options. And there's also Dynax Pro. And if we see here, we've got 50 millimeters a second, 8 millimeter raise height. We're still doing 0.05 millimeter layers or 50 micron, 2 second light off delay. Our base layers are going to be 40 seconds. We're going to need to adjust this for your resin. We're doing 4 base layers, and then your regular layers are set currently to 1.2 seconds. You can hit the plus here, and you could create your own config. So I'll just 3D PC. I'll just make our own copy of this, put it in Dynax mode, and you could set this to, you could play with different motor speeds, different base layers. So in my case, I'm going to up this to 50 seconds for 4 layers, and we're going to start around 1.4. We're going to print our resin exposure test. Under advanced, I'm not going to change anything here. And I'll hit add. So now I've got my own copy of this, so I can override the values, because if we try to edit this, you can see that these are locked, right? If we go to our copy, we can see that I'm able to make some changes. So we'll set that at 1.4, and let's drag in a resin exposure test. Okay, so this little flat card here, it's kind of hard to see on this angle. But we get smaller and smaller details. We have small gaps here in between these towers. You know, this hole should be fully open. If we're overexposing, this hole might be closed in. There's a bunch of things that we can test here. We've used the Amerilabs town test print in the past as well, and I may also print that one. We'll start with this. It uses very little resin, takes very little time to print, and using Dynax, it should take significantly less time to print. So let's hit slice. And we can see kind of a layer by layer you can see layer by layer what that looks like in the preview window. So that's what would be showing up on the LCD screen. And we've got our 1.4 seconds as we saw in the config there. Now if I hit upload, that's uploading to Creality Cloud. If I hit save, I can put it on a USB stick and walk it over to the printer. But in this case, I'm going to hit print. And so here it's found the Halot Mage Pro on my network. This is what I'm going to print it to. I've got to enter the password, which we just set as ABC. And we set that on the printer screen in the settings. We can see that the printer is currently free, it's not doing anything. And we'll hit send file. All right, and now we can hit start printing. I've made sure that the build platform is clear. And now in the background, the printer is moving the build plate all the way to the bottom, and it's going to start printing. Now, if you have a webcam hooked up, you can hit view, and it would actually show the camera feed here. We don't have a camera on this printer. You can also choose to pause or stop it here. And if you go into settings, you can actually make changes to the exposure time and stuff. What's interesting is that the speed and exposure time and everything that's shown in this view is not at all what we just sent to the printer. So I'm not sure why those two things don't match. I would not make changes from here. I would actually walk over to the printer and do that, but you can override those settings. And in that view, it also showed it's going to take about 9 minutes and 24 seconds. We can see those stats up here as well. It's going to use 3.4 milliliters of resin. There's 59 layers, 3.8 grams. It says 8 minutes and 22 seconds on this one. Also worth noting, if you have the auto resin feed system turned on, it will actually start feeding in resin until it hits an appropriate level, and then it will turn off. You can also press the buttons on the pump to turn them off if you'd like. Another test print that we can do is from 3D Resin Solutions, who happens to be the manufacturer of the resin that I'm using. And they call it the Starship. So here's the Starship. You can see all the very fine details here. There are a couple supports that are built in right here for the back of the 3, and I believe the back of the S as well, just showing varying angles. And these little pillars here should have these bulgy tops that are kind of 90-degree squared off there. If you see this being like tapered, then that's not ideal. It should go straight out. And then a bunch of these little spines that are getting smaller and smaller. I find that sometimes some of these fall over just under their own weight because they are so thin. And we have some voids here that should be see-through the whole way through to the other side, right? If these are not, then that means we're overexposing. So their website has an entire page dedicated to how to read the results of this, but those are just a couple things I wanted to point out. And I think we're actually going to do this in Dynax as well. but we're going to reduce this. After the results of the first print, I'm just going to try to push it a little bit further and do 1.3, but we're definitely in the ballpark. There was quite a bit of overexposure with 50 seconds as the base layers, which, you know, if you're using a raft or something and lifting this off, that's fine. In this case, you would see that kind of elephant's foot here at the bottom, where it would be flared out because those bottom layers are overexposed. There are 4 of them, so it'll be about 0.2 millimeters in height. We're doing 50 micron layers. And in this case, I don't really care that it's overexposed at the bottom, but it's just something to be aware of. And I'm going to bring it down to 40 and see that we still have good build plate adhesion. And so we'll hit slice. And again, we can see the preview. It's only going to take 30 minutes and 3 seconds or so using these settings here. And so I'll hit print and upload it to the printer over Wi-Fi. We're back, and I've played with this guy for just about a week now, on and off on my spare time. And I have obviously a bunch of prints. So first things first, we printed what I believe is called the Starship from 3D Resin Solutions. It's a exposure calibration print. And I chose this one because, well, I'm familiar with it and how to read it, but also because I happen to be using 3D Resin Solutions 8K high resolution resin on these prints. So this print was done at a 1.3 second exposure time, and things turned out great, except for a couple little features. So I'm not going to go over exactly how to read this. We will link to the page and the file on their site where you can go over how to analyze the results for yourself. But up front, there's these little towers, and the tops of the towers kind of popped off. So it could almost be a little bit underexposed or just luck of the draw because they are really fine features. But everything else looked perfect. You can see through the little holes here on the wings, so they're not overexposed. The towers here, they're sharp and crisp. The hollow sections here are sharp and crisp, and they don't bleed into each other. And all of them are discernible. You know, the very smallest one might disappear if you're a little high on the exposure side. But all in all, I have no complaints about how this turned out. So we're in the ballpark there. I also printed a flat one here. Actually, I printed this one first because number one, it takes almost no time to print, being that it's so very few layers. It's, you know, maybe a millimeter high or so. And so if I'm really far off on my exposure settings, it's a little more forgiving. So features like those little towers and stuff, if I was way off, they could break off or not render at all. So this is a little more forgiving. And I was at 1.4. I decided to push it a little bit more to 1.3 seconds here. And this turned out beautiful at 1.4, actually. It doesn't have any signs of overexposure. One way to test is these corners here. They're kind of progressively, you know, coarser and then progressively finer. And even the finest one, they are all distinct individual pillars. There's no kind of bleed or overexposure indication there. And obviously the base layers are overexposed by design to stick that on the build plate. So when you're looking through these little holes, they won't be all the way through because those base layers are bled significantly wider than they're supposed to be. But they all rendered perfectly other than that. So I knew I was in the ballpark. I played a little risky and went 1.3. So we're somewhere between 1.3 and 1.4. That should be acceptable for this resin. Now, with that said, the first thing I decided to print was a file off the model library. So when this is connected to the internet there, the model library has a whole bunch of pre-sliced files. All of those files are sliced for the non-Dynax mode of this printer. The USB stick did come with a couple files that were done in Dynax, and as you saw in the screencast for the slicer, Dynax is the higher speed option. So after the calibration prints, the first thing I printed was from the model library. So when you go to print and you're connected to the internet, either Wi-Fi or hardwire, you can go to model library and it shows a whole bunch of pre-sliced files for this printer that you can just select, it'll download them, and then you can print. If you're doing that, you're gonna wanna override those sliced settings with the exposure times that are for your resin. So as we mentioned here, 1.3, 1.4 seconds for the regular layers, and I was doing between 40 and 50 seconds on the base layer, which may be a little bit much, but I wanna make sure it stays stuck to the build plate. And the first print that I did failed spectacularly. I woke up in the morning and it was actually in the vat there, completely off the build plate. Granted, it was a very large, like full build volume print. I forget exactly which one it was. So I decided to re-level and print again, and I printed this guy. So in printing this guy, I hadn't yet tested the auto refill pump feature. So I filled the vat with resin and I printed this. I didn't top up the vat enough or at all after my first failed print, and this used quite a bit of resin. The walls on this base here are like a solid 2 millimeters thick. He's probably 2 millimeters thick all around, just judging by his weight. And so I ran out of resin. The way this is printed is he is, well, like this from your perspective. So he's printing like this. This would be the last point on the print that was printed. And there was only a couple puddles of resin left. And at one point, there was no puddle in this area, so this didn't cure at all. And there's a little bit of defect here because it was still coming off the build plate at the one far extreme side. So I leveled the build plate again. Then I printed a bunch of these all over the build plate to make sure that they are all equally, stuck there. And I think I may have even bumped the base layers up to 50 seconds at that point just to play it safe. But anyway, I don't fault the printer for this. This is completely user error. And after that, we did play with the pump, and I'll talk about that in a second. Ignoring that, this turned out beautiful, even though it was coming detached from the build plate. There's no real indication of that anywhere on the upper body here, other than here. And yeah, it turned out good. It's not a super high detailed print though. Like, there's no really tiny features. If you think about fur on an animal and the texture of that fur, that kind of thing, you want to make sure you can capture that. But turned out great nonetheless. These are all 50 micron layer heights, or 0.05 millimeters. And then I printed this guy. I think this is Eevee. Hopefully I got that right. And it was printed, yeah, with the support structure all on the back here. It does have some pockmarks and stuff from the support structure, but that would be the front side. And his nose would be the last piece that was printed. And so what you're looking at in this direction is basically the X and Y, which is where we have that ultra high resolution from the 8K screen. Turned out absolutely beautiful. Some of these marks here are really just from transport. It got banged around in the bag with the other prints, so it turned a little white where it gets scratched. And there is a drain hole in the back here. And one thing that I did not do very well is when I rinsed this in my ultrasonic cleaner with IPA and then drained it and dried it, I started curing it in my curing oven, my UV oven, and it started to leak resin out the back. So clearly there was still some moisture there. And so it left this like white shiny residue as it kind of leaked and cured. Definitely not ideal. Now if you're painting it or something, it's not a problem. It is all definitely cured. It just has a different kind of look to that. So again, user error, but you might run into these things, so why not show you? And then I printed these, because I wanted something that I knew had extremely small details. Now, these are little miniatures. I know we got some close-up shots. His hands apparently are separate pieces that kind of plug onto these. I sliced this in Halot box, and that's what I showed some of the Dynax settings. These were printed in Dynax. And I tried two different exposures. So I did 1.4 and 1.3. 1.4 and 1.3, just to see if there was any discernible difference between the two of them, and there really isn't. If I had to argue, I would say that the 1.3 here does look a little bit crisper, but I'm really splitting hairs. And hopefully it shows up in the pictures, but it turned out beautiful. There's even kind of a wooden texture to these pieces down here on this like shieldy material, and you can still see that in the resulting print, so that's kind of cool. And they printed ridiculously fast as a result of both the fast speeds in Dynax mode, but also the 1.3, 1.4 second layers. And then I printed this. This is also off the model library. So when it's off the model library, it's pre-sliced, it's pre-supported. You just download it change the exposure and hit print. And so I did this. This was called, I think it said Puss in Boots Evil or something like that, which sounded kind of neat. Reminds me more of Master Splinter here, but he's a two-piece, so there is a slice. You'd have to, patch that and fill that. But turned out great. Again, not super high detail as far as small features goes, but printed great nonetheless. You can also see the internal structure that was sliced into there to support some of the steep overhangs on the inside, so it's got internal support like that. And what happened to his foot here? So he is a multi-part print, he has arms as well, but I ran out of resin. And I know you're wondering, you already ran out of resin once, you said you were going to use the pump, what happened here? I did use the pump, and I used the pump successfully on other test prints. The moment it lowers below the pump inlet nozzle, so the inlet nozzle right here has like a capacitive sensor of sorts in it, and when the resin level is below that, the pump kicks on if you have it on auto pump mode, and it will fill back up until that sensor senses the level back up to the top. That worked great on other prints, intentionally put very little resin in there and then watched it fill. On this one, I actually ran out of resin in the bag. So the resin that I'm using from 3D Resin Solutions is in a large kind of Tetra Pak kind of bag, almost like a Capri Sun or something like that, Kool-Aid jammers, if you will. And the bag is probably this high, and that causes kind of two problems. Number one, it's kind of difficult to tell how much resin is left in the bag itself, rather than it being in a bottle. But number two, the tube comes out here and my bag is, say, this high. So that tube barely reaches the bottom of the bag. And if you move that bag at all, now the tube is not reaching the bottom of the bag. So the combination of running out of resin, but also the tube not being at the very bottom of the bag, the pump kicked on and there was nothing to pump. So it kept printing and it didn't render the feet, obviously, the last features there. So I guess the rule of thumb here is make sure you have resin left in your reservoir, your bag, or your bottle. Make sure this is all the way to the bottom of that reservoir. And I still would not entirely rely on it. It's a nice kind of backup or fail-safe or additional feature. And another feature that it does have is it can pump the resin out of your vat. So, if you hit you have a in and an out button. So out will suck the resin up and pump it back into the bag. In obviously goes this direction, and then stop, of course. If you hit out, it just sucks out the resin until you tell the pump to stop. And when it's calling for resin, it just keeps pumping until it reaches that level, even if that never actually happens. What would be nice is if it was calling for resin and it didn't reach the level it was expected to shut off, it never shut off, it should just pause the print. Like something has gone wrong, I'm calling for resin, we're running out of resin, you put it in auto pump mode, so clearly you expect me to be able to fill it and it's not working. It's obviously different if I'm not using the pump at all, then that's completely on me. So with a minor software tweak, that's totally doable, I'm sure. Anyway, all that said, it's really nice to print a lot faster than, if we go back a few years, print a lot faster and with insane X and Y resolution on a printer like this. It's relatively quiet. I didn't use the vent system at all, actually. Between the resin I was using and just the fact that it's pretty well sealed, I didn't have any kind of noxious odors issues. I'm also not super sensitive to that, and it is in a big open space. So that would have worked just perfectly. Connect that, turn the AP on, and it will actually vent and continue to vent for your set time period after the print has ended. So that's something that you can make use of if you see the need to. But the other thing that I'd like to mention is the fans on the bottom here. So there's kind of a shroud at the bottom with the fans that cool the LED or the LED array under there. They aren't obnoxious. You know that there's a printer running. It's kind of a soft whir. And I was taking conference calls in the same room and it was not an issue. So that gives you kind of an idea of the level of the sound. I've heard people complain about the sound, but I don't know what they're comparing it to. I've had plenty of printers that are far, far louder than this in the resin space. Hopefully you found all that useful, and remember, like and subscribe and ring the bell to get notified when we upload more videos like this. Thanks for watching.